Welcome to the second episode of the Finpact Hub. I'm your host, Jana Al-Balani, and today I have a very special guest joining me in the conversation on developmental finance and economics. Our guest is a pioneer in the field, paving the way for meaningful impact created through economic policy, financial tools, and public sector consulting. She currently serves as a manager in the Office of Development Affairs in the UAE Presidential Court and has experience in economic and public sector consulting with the World Bank Group and other consulting firms, and experience in program development for the United Nations Development Program, and a wealth of knowledge across policy, strategy, and real-world implementation. So I'm so grateful to have her here today, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Ms. Isha Sharma to the Finpact Hub. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I'm super excited for our conversation today.
Me too. Thanks for having me, Jana.
So before we get started, would you like to just give us a brief introduction of yourself, a brief introduction into what you do day to day and your personal mission and the work that you do?
Sure. That's a loaded 3 questions,
Yes.
but I'll try my best to answer. So I've been working in international and sustainable development for more than 10 years now. And I've looked at it from different vantage points, and I've had the opportunity to look at it from a grassroots angle when I worked at an NGO in India. I looked at it from a very policy think tank angle when I worked for the UN and the World Bank, and a very strategic and execution angle when I worked for consulting at the BCG. And now that I work for the UAE government. So it's given me a very holistic perspective on development projects and how development projects to be successful and for countries to actually get out of their economic trap and poverty cycle. You need to make sure you have this tripartite angle of making sure the programs are designed well, they're executed well, and they're funded well in order for development to be actually be growth.
I think that's a really good point, and something that we see that's missing a lot in developmental programs is that there's always an area, a perspective that's missing that is usually really crucial to making real impact. So I think, your experience in all of these different perspectives puts you at a really good, vantage point for you to be able to approach issues like this with, multiple perspectives. And we were talking earlier off camera about that you've been finding a lot of meaning in the work that you do. And I think that's something super important, especially in the field that you work in. You need to have purpose to do it and for you to make real impact. So I wanted to know a bit more about, the personal mission that drives you to work in the field that you do and why it gives you meaning.
It's given me meanings ever since I was a kid. I think I've been wanting to do something that is connected to something higher than myself and beyond just earning money. Never, ever, it was a mission of mine to, earn money or be super rich. That was more of a side effect. I want to do, and whatever I do something out of love and out of something that I like. And I'm very mission driven. And for me, it's always about, if you're really passionate about what you're doing, you automatically become very good at it because you want to learn about it, you enjoy it, and you revel in working for it and learning about it. So you're continuously growing in it. And if you're doing that, your wealth and, success comes as an outcome and a byproduct rather than the destination. So I'm always geared towards that. And my personal mission is honestly making people happy. And I do that in 2 ways. I make sure that people or populations and individuals who don't have the basic necessities, such as food on their table, water, clean water to have shower with or bathe with or drink, healthcare facilities, that making sure that they have that through my current work in development all along. And for the people who do have all these resources, like in Dubai and more, since we have everything and all the material comforts, we're still facing a level of dissatisfaction and unhappiness without pointing a finger to it. Even though we're getting all that we want, there's still some level of dissatisfaction or loss of meaning in life. And I teach meditation and mindfulness, life coaching, multimodality movement through yoga and Pilates to bring that sense of meaning and purpose and joy, to learn to be resilient, because both in the development world and in the individual growth world, it's not about growth anymore. Shocks, both inner and outer, are going to exist. In the development world, you have conflicts, you have geopolitical tensions, you have climate change, you have all kinds of shocks. And in your inner world, you have all kinds of shocks from stress, the ups and downs of life, one high, one low, whether it's jobs or relationships. So there are shocks in both angles. So just growing is not enough. Being able to respond to the shocks in a better, quicker way with less or least damage done to you, whether you're a country or whether you're a person. I personally think of countries as personalities and individuals when you're thinking of their needs and wants and incentives. But in both ways, it's all about resilience for development of both these dual angles rather than growth.
I think that's a really nice way that you've put it. Comparing, your inner world and the outer world and the comparisons between them. And it just goes to say how much, the values that you have, they're consistent in all areas of your life. So in the work that you do and in the work that you do after work, after you clock out, your values are common in all of them. So let's dive in a bit deeper. Let's start with what is developmental economics and finance?
Oh, deep question and a big question.
Yeah.
So in short words, development economics is figuring out what works and what doesn't work to get people, incentives, and institutions to align to economically develop and socially develop and get out of poverty, so they speak. Development finance is, we know what works from development economics. It's about how do we scale up the solutions that do work for higher impact and execution.
Okay.
So that's how they feed onto each other. So development economics is more about diagnosis and strategy, and development finance is about implementation, execution, and scale.
Okay. So developmental finance is more of like the tools that we use to be able to implement the policies created by developmental economics. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's more about the execution part, and it's easier to come up with ideas. There's no shortfall of ideas in this world, and good ideas even. There are lots of good ideas, even in the field of development economics and social impact. What's hard is to translate these into scalable, bankable deals, and what's harder is to execute them and see them through the finish line. It's very easy to start a project, but to see it through, because development projects aren't often just 1 year or 2 years. They can go on for a decade or 2 decades. And to see the actual impact, which is job creation or improved health outcomes or improved literacy, it takes an entire generation.
That's true.
So it's a very long-term perspective that you have to take. And so when we look at these both into account, development econ can give you the best solutions. But when you actually sit on the table and you think, okay, do they actually make sense? Are they actually workable? Will the different stakeholders align and agree to them? That's a whole new deal together.
I think that's a really good point that you brought up, and something we'll definitely dive into more towards later. That we'll dive into more later in the episode about, the disconnects between creating a really good policy and then seeing it all the way through, making sure it's creating a real impact. So let's talk about that a bit more. I think personally, I'm really interested into knowing what the process looks like. So how do you really decide what economic policy is ideal for a country? How do they differ? So, if we were to sit down now and create a policy, how does it happen? What do we start with? How do we start looking at the issues? You know better than me. So let me know how does that process work?
Jenna, you're asking such loaded questions. I'm going to make the answers very applicable. So what's unique about Dev Econ and the international development world is you don't have to, or you should not, or I'm not going to say should, the best perspective or the best approach to look at it is to combine both macro and micro economics and policy. So if we look at just macro and we don't look at the micro, when you're actually implementing the development policy to scale, it's not going to work. And then if you're just looking at the macro and you're not looking at the micro, it's not going to scale and get much funding. So you need to combine and integrate both angles. And so when you're looking at the macro policy, I would look at, I would say 3 Ps, right? You need to look at the politics, you need to look at the proof, and then you need to look at the price. So when I talk about the politics, it's not just the government, it's about the people. Are the people aligned? Does the government in particular think it's feasible? Is there government buy-in for this? What are their budgets? Are they focusing on this project, or are they focusing on their sectors, or do they have other bigger concerns, which even though they would like to focus on better health outcomes, but they have a tax burden or they have debt distress, which many developing countries have, that they need to get out of their way to actually develop the country, right? So that's one angle. The second one is proof. So we have a lot of policies, but what policies have actually worked in this context? A policy, say in one country in South Asia, may not work for a policy in sub-Saharan Africa. And one policy in Australia might definitely not work in sub-Saharan Africa again. So we have to look at the contextual space, the stakeholders involved, the climate involved, the history, political history involved, to see if it actually is sustainable and scalable. And have proof, valid proof for that, that's tangible. And then the third one is price, is that, what is the budget that we have, and how much capital are different stakeholders bringing in. So currently there's a 4 trillion gap, a development finance gap for developing countries in order to bridge the development finance gap.
That's a huge number.
That's a huge number. And I feel we think that we keep saying the private sector is the tool. And yes, they are a great component and a great stakeholder that can catalyze these investments and close the gap, because the government sector can't do it alone, nor can philanthropic capital, because philanthropy is meant to catalyze new innovations and developments. But the main, stakeholder that can really move the needle is the private sector. But at the same time, the private sector is not a magic solution. The private sector is a tool to enable the policies or the solutions that we're offering. But the solutions and the policies and the design of the program has to be rigorous enough to allow the private sector to come in.
That's a really good point. So would you say that the role of the private sector in funding projects like these really rely on how sound the policy is itself and the structure of, these developmental plans?
They rely on a lot of factors. Before I get onto that, I'm going to answer the second part of your question, because that's the macro part of it. So it's about, the macro part is more about incentives and institutions. And that's very important when you're thinking from a usability standpoint, right? So and then I really learned that when I was working in the developing countries in NGOs. I was in India and I was, working with farmers, and I was on the field, I was in their houses, I was working with the villagers and talking to them and really understanding why they need what they need and actually what they need. And sometimes what we think they need from, sitting in an office and analyzing the population versus when you're on the ground and talking to them and seeing what they need are very different. And I think we need to bridge that gap together. And incentives is also all about knowing, would they actually do this, right? They might need this. The population in X country might need a vaccination, but they might not be incentivized to take the vaccination because they would rather, there's some cultural bias about it, there's some societal bias about it, or they would rather, not go to the hospital, which is inaccessible to them or far or inconvenient, and they would rather have their kids or their families work on the fields to get more money. So we have to think about these nuances and really go into their shoes and know that incentives are not about just knowing, is this what they need and is this what they're looking for, but going sort of a step deeper and a layer deeper to think about, is the solution and the behavior we're offering easy and accessible and likable for them, right? It's not that I can tell you what to do. I can tell you, this is, Jana, you should go for this class or you should do this thing because it's good for you. And you clearly know what's good for you, and majority of the population knows what's good for them. But the reason it doesn't become habitual, it's because it's not easy. It's not something that they look forward to or that they like. And it's not something that they're familiar with. And so in order for a policy or a government change or, a developmental change to be implemented for a sustainable long period of time and to scale, you need to make sure that the solution that you're offering is likable, it's accessible, and people want to go out of their comfort zones in order to do it. And even better, it's comfortable for them, right? And as soon as it's comfortable and likable and accessible for them, they will automatically do it because that's the easiest and least frictionless thing for them to do. And as soon as that happens, the change will happen. So that's the long answer to the incentive question. And the other one is institutions.
So you were saying earlier about how sometimes there's a difference between, the ideal solution and the policy and what the people actually need. So the people who are setting the policies are often not in the shoes of the people who need the policy change, who need the changes to happen. So what kind of research is done to really know what is actually needed and to kind of take that initiative to put ourselves in the shoes of the people who need this change?
Honestly, the best way to know the perspectives of the people who we are solving for is to interact with them. You can't be in a siloed room and make policies for a user that you don't know about. Even in business, you have to know your customer, you have to know your market. In the development world, because it's not business out of profit, but the same principle applies. You have to know your beneficiary or your target user, who you want the impact and outcomes to grow. When you look at development finance from this way, there's something called constraints-based thinking, which is one of the essential pillars, I would say, of development econ or development finance. It's not about, X solution is great and should be implemented. Because again, there are a lot of solutions out there in the world. The reframing to think about is, what is the biggest constraint here? What is the biggest bottleneck? And often it's not just lack of money. That's a very large, vague problem. And if someone says it's just lack of money, that's not the point. Is it because there's a skills mismatch that they're not getting employed? Is it because the literacy rates are low? Is it because they don't have electricity or the reliable infrastructure to transport from one place to another? So it's usually an infrastructure gap, a education literacy gap, a health constraint. As soon as you identify and really hone in on the key bottleneck, that's when you start going from a problem first solution design thinking. So you need to be human centric. And that's what design thinking is about, like human centric problem solving. So the best way is to identify what is the constraint, what is the exact problem, and then work backwards to solve for it. So that is one lens that's very, very important that you need to think about constraint. And the second one, as I mentioned, is incentives. Incentives. If I'm a household, it'll be more about, say any policy. It'll be like, can I trust them? And what is in it for me? If it's a firm, it's about, okay, will I be making money out of this? If it's a government, it'll be, is my tax budget actually worth it? Will everyone, on the table be agreeable to this? If you're a leader, it'll be, and if you're a democracy, it'll be, will I get votes for this? Is it a tangible, physically evident policy because my term is getting over? If you're an investor, it'll be, what are the risks involved? So you have to not only go in the shoes of the user, as you said, but you have to go into the shoes of everybody involved from in the financing stage, in the designing stage, in the execution stage, and in the receiving stage. And what we often forget is also the monitoring, impact, and learning stage, which is an essential part of international development.
I think that's a really interesting point that you brought up, is that to work backwards is to work backwards from the solution, from the problem. So identifying what the problem actually is rather than what we think it is and what we think people need, but actually, going to a micro level. ground level, research and really understanding what these kind of communities need. Whether it's, poverty, unemployment, low literacy rates, and really just understanding the foundation of it and then building from there. So I think that was a really interesting point.
Definitely. And I would also, now that I think about it and as I talk about it, I wouldn't even frame it as a solution, because if we're framing it as a solution, we're like, going to the population and saying, oh, this is what we think is right and you should definitely implement them. And that's when usage or adoptability doesn't happen, which is why behavioral science and behavioral economics are so integral to make sure it's, adoptable and used. Because inclusivity, what we say, AI inclusivity or inclusivity of a policy or inclusivity of an infrastructure is not so much about who has access to it, but it's about, is it usable for a long period of time? And that's what it makes all the difference. I can have access to it once, but can I use it for a long period of time? Is it usable and is it reliable? To make sure that it's sustainable. And those are the two key factors that really matter.
Does it make sense?
Yes.
I heard someone say this from someone who works in the field as well. And they were talking about the importance of including the people that we're trying to serve in the conversation on, what type of policy we're going to be implementing, what type of change we're looking to have. Because really, I think that seat at the table, that reserved seat, should be for them, because they are, the most important stakeholder. Everything that is going to be done should be done for them. So it's really important to include them in the conversation to really understand what they need. Okay, let's talk about something a bit more practical. Can you share maybe a success story throughout your experience, a project that you worked on that you think had a really positive outcome?
Yes, I have a lot of them. One of them is very close to my heart. So when I was working on the field back in India, I was taking menstruation awareness workshops and health and sanitation workshops in rural villages in the south of India. And it's called something called participatory rural appraisal, where you get, the rural populations from different age groups to come together and you play games in order to almost brainstorm solutions and empower communities and create champions for change. And one of the solutions we were improving was the usability of toilets. So, for instance, India had a whole movement called Swachh Bharat. So basically, yes, I was working in these rural areas and working in WASH, so water, sanitation, and health outcomes. And India was carrying out a Swachh Bharat mission at that time, where they wanted to install 120 million toilets and end open defecation. So toilets then they built these toilets all over, but people were still not using them, especially in rural areas. And when we found out, it was very interesting, and that's what I mean, really getting into the shoes of people and understanding where they're coming from. From them, the thing was they would construct these toilets, but they wouldn't be the infrastructure for them to have proper waste disposal. So on top of that, they would really smell. So we were trying to solve for that problem and create a behavioral change around that. And we found the key behavioral change needle movers were women of the village. So there was this woman, I don't want to name her, so let's call her Kanta, right? Kanta Bai. And Kanta Bai saw a toilet as a signifier and a symbol of her freedom. Because for a woman to, in these villages, women would go to the restroom at 5 a.m. in the morning, and they would not go throughout for almost 12 hours, and then they would go in the evening as a group, because it's not safe for them to go alone, because they risk molestation, they risk a lot of things. They risk their life even in some cases. So it was a question of not only dignity, but safety and mere survival for these women. And they became a movement in these villages that they decided they would not marry a man unless they built a toilet. And so it became a whole movement. And that's when we created the behavioral change of what a toilet meant to a woman, and created this society groups and these women groups to actually discuss that and empower women. And it was a community-led movement. So we weren't telling that this is the solution for you, which is what I was talking about. We were saying, this could be a solution and this is a product, but it means something that's much more to them. It's not just the toilet where they, it's not a usage debate now. It's who I am as a person and what do I want as a person. I want more dignity, I want more safety, and I want a healthier and happier life. And that's when you cater to that for an individual, that's what builds and that's what lasts. We take these little things for so granted, but this little room, can mean freedom and dignity and safety, and not risking the rape of, getting assaulted by someone, or risking, their life. And it's something that's so meaningful. So for me, that was an example of something that's, the learning lessons were build from root up, follow the Socrates method. So the Socrates method is about asking them the right questions and them coming up with the solutions themselves, validating their self-beliefs, questioning their self-beliefs, and then coming to a conclusion that, okay, this is what I need at this point. So it's very, very much based from them, right? Like you're being a mentor and a coach rather than someone who's telling them what to do. So that's what works. Then second is what works, associate it with behavioral change and associate it with values that resonate with them. So when we resonated the toilets not as a dingy room that, is dirty, is smelly, doesn't have the right infrastructure. Also, we solved for that, of course. You install a light, you have the right waste disposal mechanism so they don't stink. They're not, otherwise they'll be breeding grounds for disease rather than actually solving for them. So they'll defeat their purpose and actually backlash.
So you take the feedback and
yes,
still work with, the values that they have.
Exactly. So you've solved for the direct problem, which is infrastructure and that it's dark and it's dingy. But also you just reframe the narrative from it being something that's dirty for something that is restoring and emphasizing their dignity and safety. And the third is really connect with them. Because the reason we had these participatory rule appraisals, the reason that we had, these workshops is to connect with the people we're trying to solve for. I'm not in support of, calling these people or naming people as poor, or, it's victimizing them, or we're giving them a solution, or we're solving their problems. They're smart. They know what to do. They're surviving. They're so much more resilient than we are. And in most cases, happier than we are, despite such limited resources. We're not solving their issues. We're facilitating them. We are trying to figure out their pain points, and we're being facilitators to their empowerment. And it's a dialogue of empowerment that needs to be created, especially in the development world, rather than a dialogue of victimization, because I feel that's very colonial.
Yeah.
So if we shift that dialogue into more of, we're in a partnership, let's do this together and let's work out better outcomes for a community as partners, rather than I'm your savior, I'm coming to give you a solution, and this is the best solution you should implement, and let's take it from there. They know what's best for their community because they have been there. They live this reality day to day. So they should be the one telling us what they want, and we should be the one implementing for them, rather than vice versa.
Giving them a seat at the table, like we were talking about.
Exactly. And again, it's a partnership because they know best, because they have lived experience, but we also have case studies of what worked, which they may not be aware about. So which is why you need a more partnership co-creator model rather than a victimization model.
That's a really important reframing there that you did, that it's a partnership and they both need each other. The population itself is extremely resilient. They know what they need. And they ultimately, the success of any policy relies on them, right? And how well they adapt to the policy or implement it themselves. So, but on the other hand, also the people implementing the policy, they have, the experience, the data, the proof to back up, the policies from an expertise point of view. So it's more of an implementation thing, and empowering the people we're trying to serve with the tools that they need, and then leaving the rest up to them.
Yes, I think it's not just leaving rest up to them. It's almost like, you have to be co-creators in the entire process.
And yeah, just continuously being involved. But what I meant by leaving the rest up to them is that, the rest, it's their decision to make, with what to do with the resources that they're given, and the support that they're given. And then the support can come. Well, it should come, and it should last throughout. Because you were talking earlier as well about monitoring and impact measurement. Maybe we can talk a bit more about how important that is in the process and the second phase of implementing a policy. It's not just implementing it and leaving it, right? But continuously being involved and measuring the impact.
Yeah, definitely. That is an integral part of development policies, and we often think monitoring and evaluation should be at the end, but monitoring and evaluation actually should be throughout. So when I was working at the World Bank, I was working for the Independent Evaluation Group, and that's when I realized the importance of MEL. So it's monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So you monitor, you evaluate, and you always learn, and you feed back the learning into a loop onto all stages of the implementation, the design process. And when you were talking about measuring impact, it's very also important to reframe the thinking around impact. The impact may be why we do things. And it's interesting, and often we may fall into the trap of looking at activities and not necessarily outcomes. So if we reframe measurement and impact to say, an activity is, we did this training for 10,000 people. The outcome, however, is, did it lead to increased job creation? Did people actually do something out of training? How many people actually, you train 10,000 people, but 10,000 people may have attended it for the first few days. On the second week, how many actually, fell out of it? Were there more men than women? What does that do to the overall economy? You train them, but in what field? Which sector? Is it a sector that's growing, or that's a sector that's needing more jobs? What are the skills that you're teaching? So outcome-based thinking is what generates impact. And the best question when you're developing a policy or a social impact program is to go to the counterfactual, is to think, if I did not develop this policy change or this recommendation or this program design, what would have changed anyway, right? So if I did not intervene, would anything have changed? And if the answer is that this would have happened anyway without you coming in, then you're not really making a change. But if something would have not happened if you didn't come in, which we call testing the hypotheses essentially, then it's something that you're actually contributing towards.
That's a really good point. Something I didn't know either, but that was really interesting. And I liked what you were saying earlier about, separating the impact into the activity and the outcome. Because I think maybe a lot of the failures that we see in this field is that, there's this great effort, a policy that was done, but we didn't really see a positive outcome from it, or the intended outcome wasn't there for several reasons, whatever the reason might be. So let's talk about that a bit more. Maybe why sometimes a really great policy that on paper looked amazing, that was really well studied, why did it fail?
So it's never that intentions aren't good. 99.9% of policies, especially in the development or general public policy that come from, this sphere, they have good intentions. The people have good intentions, whether it's to increase jobs, whether it's to do X, Y, Z. So it's not the intentions, but it's the execution that fails. So most policies, 99.999%, come from a good intention. They are benevolent and they come from a service-oriented mindset with some benefit to society and the stakeholders involved. The reason why they often don't work is few reasons. One is constraints, like I spoke about. We are looking from a solution perspective, not necessarily a constraints perspective. If we just identify the biggest needle mover and the biggest bottleneck and focus from there as a starting point, that could have the most impact. Second is the stakeholders and incentives once again. The private sector, the public sector, the philanthropic sector, the NGO sector, and the actual user, they have different ways of looking at the problem. And the solution can be great, but mobilizing finance for it might not be favorable to all the stakeholders involved, right? If you look at development finance, say you have a renewable energy project in a frontier market, which is highly promising in terms of development impact it creates. And it gets a lot of concessional capital from the development sector, from an ex-government. And they're looking, you get money from the philanthropic capital because it's very high promising, it's innovative, and so you get a grant from there. But the private sector is, who is the biggest change maker in this field, for example, they have hesitancy and they're hesitant to come in. And it's hard to understand why, right? And then suddenly, instead of concessional capital, the government or, the main funder gives a guarantee. So a guarantee is like a cushion where you're covering the risk. You're saying, if this project doesn't work, we understand you work in these X markets. This is a risky business for you. If this doesn't work, we will pay for the first 10 to 20% of it. So you don't have to absorb the first risk if it goes wrong.
And who's the body that does that?
The main funder. This can be the government or, another agency, a multilateral, the main funder. And so then you suddenly get a lot of private sector bodies coming in to fund this project because the government has given it the guarantee that if it goes wrong, we have your back. So just that perception of risk going down gets more funders. So that's the incentives I'm talking about.
Just before we move on, I think that's a really, I heard something really interesting about what you said about the perception of risk. I was listening to a podcast from the World Bank. It's a series on this topic. And they were talking about how the perceived risk for investing in development projects, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, which they were talking about, is much greater than it actually is. And that is what drives, the mismatch between the funding that we need and the funding that we actually have. And that's why these programs are heavily underfunded, because in people's minds, the risk is so much greater than it is. And then they said the same thing, which is something that solved the issue, solves part of the issue, and it helped increase funding, was providing guarantees. So this is the part of, this is developmental finance, right?
Yes.
This is approaching the issue and providing a solution from it from a financial perspective.
Exactly. Because only when you have finance, you can actually get the solutions recommended in Dev Econ to scale up. And Dev Finance also, is a great field, and they already have scalable working solutions in blended finance, social impact bonds, development bonds that have worked. It's about scaling them. And the biggest obstacle to scale is risk. And if you go behind risk, why are projects risky, right? Because they're new, they're not reliable, and they're unpredictable. And
the economic environment is also can be unpredictable.
And what contributes to that, it's kind of a chicken and an egg situation, if you look at it, right? So if you look at a new frontier market, it's highly risky. It's once fair because the currency risk is really high. So, on a lot of development projects, what has happened, a lot of these developing countries have had very high debt distress because they've borrowed a lot of money. The currency rates fluctuate. and then they have to give much more money with an interest rate that's back to the government. So now the government has to choose, okay, we're in debt distress and we cannot borrow more money to actually develop, and we need to pay this debt distress out. And at the same time, you're telling us we need to have better education policies. So you're putting these vulnerable countries in a very fragile position. So that needs to be solved for, because the perception of risk is not going to get any better unless we solve for the debt distress, the changing creditor landscape that's happening, and the currency fluctuation and volatility.
And we need funding for that. So this is the chicken or the egg
Exactly.
situation.
And then you have the other risk, which comes from feasibility studies, right? So one way you can reduce the risk, besides the guarantee example that I gave you about, is to really show the stakeholders that are going to invest in it, whether it's commercial or whether it's developmental finance stakeholders and investors, that this is a very solid project. And identify the risk front hand. If you are sure and if you can predict what you're going to go through, then you have it in your head. You're able to trust the process. Versus if you have no idea, then you're going to be on your toes and flight or fight mode essentially, and it's not going to work. So the key to that is to have feasibility studies, to go to the ground, to consult, to have ESG reporting. And once you have that, you're able to give the investors a solid case of why you need to invest in this sector, in this field, or in this country. But then again, you need to have a fine balance, because sometimes we tend to get so lost in the feasibility study process that it never gets into execution. So also hard timelines are very important. And the other reason why policies tend to fail is we tend to think we have infinite capacity. So having, development projects can go on and off timeline. That's the nature of life. But this objective of having constraints-based thinking, not only in terms of the problem, but even a frugality in terms of the resources. How can we get the best possible solutions in the easiest way and in the most frugal way, right? That's not coming out of scarcity, but that's coming out of a sense of innovation and urgency. That's very important.
I think while you were saying that, I just came out of my microeconomics exam just 2 weeks ago. So I was thinking
Congrats.
thank you, expenditure minimization, like how we can maximize utility in this case, the success of the project while, also minimizing costs at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you think the role of the private sector is in funding projects like this?
So the private sector can have three roles. The first is as an employer to facilitate job creation. The second role is as an investor to actually invest in these projects through PPPs or blended finance. And the third role is through and as an innovator and distributor. Mm-hmm. So if a private sector company installs itself, they can raise the economy and reach people much faster than a public company can. And because they have commercial incentives, they're able to really infiltrate into new markets in a more innovative way.
I'm really glad we touched on that, because I think it's one of two things. Either people think that impact projects is just for the public sector, or it puts extreme pressure on the private sector to contribute, but we don't really know much of the nuances that goes into the role the private sector can play beyond just funding the programs.
Yeah.
Now, to start to end off our conversation, we've talked about a lot of positives and success stories. What, from your experience, do you feel is the biggest barrier to inclusion?
The biggest barrier to inclusion is trust and friction. So like I talked about, inclusion is not necessarily always a matter of accessibility. It's about whatever you're offering as a, I don't want to say solution, but whatever your offering is or mode of empowerment is it easy? Is it reliable? And is it safe? And as long as it's three of these, people will use it because they know it's something that's good for them. They know that it's something easy to implement and it's not something they really have to go out of the way for, and they know it's something they can trust. So the other factor connected to is trust is everything, whether it's in the bigger policy making sphere, whether it's designing and financing the deal, and whether it's about adopting it. Trust is that factor that infiltrates, and that is essential to all three levels of development.
I'm really glad you said that, because I think a lot of people were probably expecting the answer to be funding. Like, funding is the biggest barrier. But, you said trust is the most important part, and acts as a barrier if it's not there, of, the policy actually being absorbed and applied properly, and, causing the impact that we hope it does.
Yeah. So as soon as you come from the vantage point of trust and the perspective of trust, and you go into the table, even when you're developing a deal and you're thinking, how can I make sure that I create this environment of trust between the financier and all the stakeholders involved? How can I make sure that the private sector coming in or this multilateral coming in trusts me with this money? If you think it from it that way, then it doesn't become a funding issue, because if they trust you and they trust that it'll work, and you have all the proof and the documentation and the data and the studies to show that this will work and I've got your back, and the tools and mechanisms like guarantees, they will put their money in. If you tell the population or the target audience that you're trying to empower, if you say that this is workable, that's good for you, it's easy for you, and it aligns with your values, or you find a way to reframe their values, they trust that you want the best for them and you're not someone that's imposing a solution on them, and they will implement it. So trust, it's, when you talk about funding, it's almost like putting a Band-Aid solution. If we look at it from the perspective of trust, then you take a step back and say, what do I need to get that trust? And then funding, adoption becomes a byproduct, an outcome of that.
I think that is the perfect ending to our conversation. Just before we completely end the episode, do you want to do a quick rapid fire with me?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay. Okay, so
let's get started.
In almost one word or one sentence, because I know it's difficult to answer in one word. Let's start. What's one policy or a tool that you think is underrated?
Monitoring, evaluation, and learning.
Love that. One inclusion metric you actually trust?
Usage and not just access.
Okay. And one book or paper that you recommend on development finance?
Poor Economics by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo.
Love that. I'll look into it. And what's one biggest conception that you hear about impact?
Impact is about numbers and not about outcomes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it needs to be about outcomes.
Thank you so much for your time today. It was a very fruitful conversation. I genuinely really did enjoy it, and I'm sure that our listeners will enjoy it as well. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you for having me, and I'm honored to be your first guest on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.